What's the most illegal thing you've ever done without getting caught? Story 1. In college, I sold substances and was very organized about it. No phones, no names, no car, only a bike, and so on. My junior year, after about 2 to 3 years of building up a clientele and shifting people over to a network of 3 to 4 guys who bought in quantity, around 1 to 2 pounds a week, I was moving close to 10 pounds a week of low-grade product we called brown frown. I had already stopped using by then and was at the top of my game using codes, counter surveillance, and every precaution I could think of. This was in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I was getting it for $350 a pound and selling it for $750 to $1,000 a pound from some organized criminals from Gary, Indiana. They were serious gangsters and I was small time compared to them. They rotated cars, had women driving to Texas to pick up shipments from, I assume, cartels. They were part of a gang that had a relative in the college who was our connection and probably the connection for most of the state. Some kids from another college had pooled their money to buy 50 pounds, paying $25,000. The next day they called saying they had $50,000 and wanted 100 pounds. So without fail, we delivered 2 large containers of nasty molded brown frown to these 2 college kids. We made them drive around for hours while my other guys tailed them, watched, called, hung up, basically messing with them nonstop to make sure they were legit, not talking to police, not meeting anyone else, constantly on phones or walkie-talkies. When they were about to leave town, I rode up on a bicycle, as planned, to where they were parked at a McDonald's eating lunch. I asked to see the money and the driver popped the trunk. I checked it was all there. A buddy pulled up and flipped the containers for cash, and I split as they chatted for a moment, going through back alleys, yards, drains, you name it, scared but greedy. My other guys switched cars 2 to 3 times, exchanging and moving money around until the next day when we met and split it up. We knew there was no way they could trace us. We were obsessive about security, names, and phones. I had studied cases of narcotics busts for years. A few weeks later, one of my best friends and partners got busted by the DEA, who were camped out in an abandoned church doing surveillance. He got some time. First charge, college kid, pled down. They recovered cash, but I didn't know he was also dealing harder substances and throwing wild parties. Long story short, he rolled on the guys he had been buying from. Not me, thankfully. They were the same organized gang from Gary. He eventually did probation, graduated, got married, and had a child. 5 years later, living a normal life as an engineer, he walked outside to take the trash out and was shot in the head in his front yard as the school bus picked up his kid. They never solved it, but the license plate number was traced to Gary, Indiana. To this day, I've never been arrested. I haven't used street substances since college, and I live a normal life. I carry a licensed firearm, and every time I walk outside my house, I feel like it could be my last. Story 2. I once transported stolen firearms across state lines to deliver to a buyer and pawn the rest. That was the worst I had ever felt, and easily the most nerve-wracking thing I had ever done. Another time, I was sitting on 2 bottles of rum as I was pulled over for speeding. I was 19 years old, alone, driving my tiny Toyota pickup about 40 miles to a party, with 2 almost full bottles of open liquor in the passenger seat. When I got pulled over, I had nowhere to hide them, so I sat on them. I also had warrants out for my arrest in a certain county in Arkansas. I was riding with a friend and got pulled over. I shoved my wallet into a crack in the door panel, told the officer I didn't have my ID, and gave the name and birthday of my best friend from high school, which I just barely remembered. Lastly, not sure if this was technically illegal, but it was probably the oddest thing I ever did. I was 18 looking for work and got offered a job smuggling a pallet of cupcakes and snack cakes into a weight loss camp. The job was offered by the sister of one of the kids there, whose father owned a small franchise bakery store. Story 3. I was a teenager who had just gotten my driver's license, but I wasn't allowed to have friends over when my parents weren't home, so we would drive to a local playground and hang out there. We preferred the old rusty metal playgrounds of our childhood because usually there were no children around, but this time there was one boy all by himself. We were going to leave him alone, but he got his toy car stuck and asked us to help. After we rescued it, he asked us to buy him a frozen drink. We said no and suggested he go home and ask a parent. Instead of going home, he had a meltdown and wet his pants. It was at least 100 degrees that day, so after about 30 minutes with a crying toddler and no responsible adult in sight, we decided to take him to the gas station. It was close to the playground, so we sat him on a beach towel, strapped him into the back seat of my car, and drove to the gas station. While waiting in line to pay for 3 drinks, I realized that technically I had just taken a 3-year-old from a public playground. I paid as quickly as possible and rushed back to the park. Still no adults were present, but the park was next to the community center. Afraid of an angry guardian showing up, we parked outside the building and I walked the boy inside. A group of senior citizens was taking a square dancing class, so I told him to go knock on the door and say, "I'm lost. Will you help me?" I really hope he found his parents. If not, maybe he ended up with an adopted grandma. I know it was irresponsible, but I was a teenager and very naive. I only wanted to prevent the boy from suffering heat stroke, but yes, technically I had taken him without permission and never got caught. Story 4. There is an annual competition held in Northern California called the Kinetic Sculpture Race. Teams come from around the state and even around the world to compete in a days-long time trial with amphibious, man-powered vehicles they design and build. The year I attended, there were some incredibly creative entries, including a large yellow septic tank outfitted with wheels and a propeller, and I was thrilled at the possibility that my team might actually win. Unfortunately, one small obstacle stood in my way. In order to compete, each entrant had to be at least 18 years old, and I hadn't quite reached that milestone. In fact, most of our team was underage since we were part of the high school robotics club. We might have been more worried about the rule, except winning wasn't just about speed. One of the most coveted awards was for Most Creative Cheaters. The race was more of a playful showcase than a strict competition. Everyone still wanted to win, but lighthearted tricks, like bribing a judge with stickers, were part of the fun. Since we were underage but determined to compete, one of my friends suggested we all make our own fake identification, with the condition that they had to look obviously fake. The results were hilarious. The friend who suggested it showed up with a tie-dye flamingo-colored card, with his photo grinning widely, and text that simply said, "I'm 18. Really, trust me, that was actually the most believable one. Mine was just a scrap of paper with "Max is totally an adult" scribbled on it because I forgot to make one until we arrived. In the end, everyone on our team got to race. We did fairly well, and even though we didn't win any speed categories, we went home with the Most Creative Cheaters trophy. The announcer even listed our pranks, stunts, and antics in detail, including the fact that we weren't technically allowed to be there at all. Story 5. When I was a senior in high school, we broke into an old house that had once been used as a photo studio. It was ancient, full of props, costumes, and computer equipment from the 1990s, and had been empty for a long time. The place was scheduled to be demolished within a few months anyway. I took a Windows 95 disk and a small hatchet prop that probably belonged to a costume. My friend, being immature, used the upstairs toilet and then sprayed a fire extinguisher all over the bathroom. We spent a lot of time looking at old photos, mostly from the late 1980s and 90s, until some construction workers came in to inspect the house. We quickly left and headed back to my friend's place, where we installed Windows 95 on some Pentium 3 machines we had pieced together from thrift store parts and spent the rest of the day playing Diablo 2 over a local connection. It turned into a surprisingly fun way to skip school with 5 other friends. Follow-up details. When the workers entered the house, it was actually pretty scary. The mess upstairs was obvious, but we were in the basement and could hear them talking and moving around above us. We slipped out the back door after they left through the front. Our backup plan was to crawl out through a basement window, well, if they came near the stairs. Since the house was so old, every sound traveled. That basement was incredible. Shelves packed with books and commercial software, a pile of computer towers, costume props, and random treasures. I even remember spotting one of the first USB expansion cards in good old PCI format. Story 6. 35 years ago, my girlfriend at the time and I crossed the border at Buffalo, New York, heading to her home in Cleveland. I was from Toronto. She had about 3/4 of an ounce hidden in her purse. A few miles before the border, she panicked, pulled out the ashtray, and stuffed it behind. I offered to hide it myself, but she insisted. Back then, the border was usually just, "Where are you from? Where are you going? Have a nice day." But that day we were asked a few extra questions and then told, Pull the car over there. The officer asked us to step out and sit on a bench while he worked over the car, lifting the hood and trunk, and even crawling down on his hands and knees to look under the glove box. My girlfriend squeezed my hand so hard she actually broke a small bone. I tried to stay calm, but inside I was dreading how I would explain to her old school dad and two older brothers that I got their daughter and little sister arrested. Jail didn't scare me nearly as much as facing them. After what felt like an eternity, the officer stood up, dusted off his knees, and said, "Okay, you can go." I bit my tongue not to ask if he was sure, just thanked him, and we drove away. We didn't speak a word until about 8 minutes later on the interstate. Then it was all, how did he miss it? To this day, I don't know if he spared us intentionally, deciding not to ruin two young lives over a small bag, or if he really didn't see it. For those who believe in karma, I was so wound up from the experience that I started speeding, got pulled over, and ended up with a $100 ticket and a lecture from an angry state trooper. Story 7. When I was younger, I stole a couple $1,000s from a job where I was the only employee because the owner never showed up. I once ran from a cop who tried to pull me over for speeding. He had to make a U-turn, and by the time he got back up to speed, I had already disappeared down a maze of back roads. At one point, someone was repeatedly breaking into my car and my neighbors' cars. One night, I decided to stay outside and wait. I had my grandfather's old hunting knife with me, just in case. Sure enough, the guy showed up. When I pulled him out of my car, he fought back. He was bigger than me and aggressive. After a couple of minutes of struggling, I pulled the knife from my pocket and jabbed it between his ribs. He stared at me, pulled back, and I could feel the blade scrape bone as he did. He stumbled away bleeding into the night. My car was never broken into again, and I never found out what happened to him. I did a lot of reckless things when I was younger, transporting substances, running from the police, and just making terrible choices. Now I'm an adult with my own home, and I don't break the law anymore. Story 8. In high school, we had a tight-knit clique of friends. Everyone in our group was incredibly close, ride-or-die type guys. We hung out constantly, shared stories, partied together, smoked, and as we got older, those of us who turned 18 first would buy tobacco, e-cigarettes, or anything the younger ones wanted. I had connections with older friends in college who could get us alcohol, sneak us into house parties, basically anything we wanted. It felt like a glorious time, dodging cops, partying, and making endless memories with my best friends. One night, one of our buddies, let's call him Jay, messaged the group chat saying he had just gotten a new car with help from his parents and asked if we wanted to cruise. Most of the group declined since it was finals week, but I said yes, and another friend D was in too. Jay rolled up in a sleek, fast car, and we picked up D around 11 that night. We spent hours doing the usual, smoking, drinking, revving the engine, racing other cars at stoplights, and flirting with girls. Since the car only had 2 seats, D was crammed into the trunk area, which was open to the cabin, so he could still see everything while being tossed around as Jay drifted and slammed on the brakes. Eventually, we got bored and headed down the highway toward a suburb. Jay kept talking about how he didn't know the car's top speed since the governor had been removed. I stupidly told him, "Nobody's out here, just punch it." So he did. We tore down the 4-lane highway, blowing past the few cars that were out. Jay called out the speed, 130, 135, 140. I recorded it, pointing the camera at the road signs flying by. Then to my horror, right under one of those signs was a police car clocking traffic. We flew past him, and before I could say anything, D yelled from the back, "Oh no!" Lights flashed far behind us and Jay panicked. We were already pushing 150 miles per hour. He screamed, "What do I do?" In my infinite stupidity, I yelled, "Keep your foot down until we find a back road turnoff." Suddenly, we were really running from the cops. This wasn't like a busted party where everyone scatters. It was just us, the direct target. Jay shouted for someone to hook up a police scanner to the O-cord. D scrambled with his phone while I pulled up maps to guide Jay. Over the stereo came the chilling words, "All available units respond. I'm in pursuit," of a vehicle moving at a very high rate of speed. My heart sank. I directed Jay to a winding country road. He screeched into it, barely holding the turn, then gunned it again. We were flying through the dark at 120 miles per hour. As we hit a T intersection, I screamed, "Left! Left!" Somehow we made it. After half a mile, no lights were behind us. Jay slowed down to 55, and we all sighed in relief. But then Dee's phone died, killing the scanner. We scrambled to connect another. Just as we got it working, Dee yelled, "Headlights behind us!" I brushed him off, laughing, telling him he was paranoid. Then I realized my phone volume had been off. I turned it up just in time to hear, "I'm on him. He's on X Road southbound, waiting on backup. I don't have plates yet." Those last words were a blessing. I screamed, "No plates! Floor it!" Chaos followed. We tore down twisting roads at 145 to 150, Dee screaming in terror, while over the scanner the officer yelled, "They're running again! I'm losing them!" We navigated the back roads by memory, and eventually the scanner confirmed, "Lost visual. Last seen southbound." In reality, we were heading north. I directed Jay to a remote lake road. We killed the lights and crawled down it, the car battered by gravel and potholes until we hid it in the woods. We sat there for almost an hour, finishing our drinks and smoking, too wired to speak. The next morning we cautiously drove home, 1 mile under the limit, signaling every move. 4 different cops tailed us on the way back, but none pulled us over. They hadn't gotten our plates the night before, and despite how obvious it must have been, they couldn't act. Looking back, I realize how close we came to destroying our lives. Drunk, high, hitting 150 miles per hour, running from the police. If Jay had lost control for even a second, the 3 of us would have been dead. If we had been caught, we'd have been locked up for a long time. It was pure luck that saved us that night. Story 9. One time a guy in our neighborhood decided to play watchdog during homecoming. He had a reputation for getting loaded on strange supplements and threatening people with baseball bats. That night he took it further, lying and claiming he had a gun, saying he would use it if we tried to leave. He blocked us in with his SUV, so we asked if we could turn our car around to talk. We were in an '84 SUV ourselves, all steel, and as soon as he reached into his pocket, we floored it. His body clipped the corner of our car and flew off to the side. I still remember hearing something metallic smack against our window. Turns out he had been bluffing with a BB gun. Storytime. This isn't my story, but one from a good friend. He was at a bar in the Midwest right before last call, around 2 in the morning. A very drunk guy shoved past him to order shots for his friends. He paid by card, insulted the bartender for being slow, and left a $0 tip, then forgot his card. My friend decided to change the 0 to a $50 tip. He then bought a round of shots and beers for his group on the guy's card, leaving another big tip for the bartender. On the way home, he broke the card into pieces and tossed it away, knowing the guy could just report it stolen the next day. If he was smart, he wouldn't have to pay a cent, and the bartender would still keep the generous tips. Story 11. I volunteered as a crisis counselor for about 18 months during undergrad. My role was to listen to victims, drive them to the hospital for exams if they wanted, and explain their legal options. Contrary to stereotypes, most assaults weren't from strangers. They were from partners or people the victims knew. One young woman came in frequently with new injuries but never wanted to file a report. Once I convinced her to allow the hospital to collect evidence in case she changed her mind, but she never pursued charges. It was always her boyfriend. And the cycle repeated: violence, apology, promises, then more violence. One morning before a lecture, I was in the bathroom when I unexpectedly came face to face with her boyfriend at the sink. Something in me snapped. I slammed his head into the hand dryer from behind, and he crumpled. I panicked, checked his pulse. He was alive. Then dragged him into a stall, sat him on the toilet, and threw his bag in with him. Looking for a distraction, I found an iPod, pocketed it, and left his bag open. I locked the stall, slid out underneath, and later tossed the iPod into a trash can outside another building, careful not to be seen. I skipped class, went back to my dorm, poured out beers to make it look like I had just been drinking all night, then walked out at noon wearing a stained shirt, casually tossing the empties. Everyone assumed I'd just been lazy and missed class. Meanwhile, her boyfriend likely woke up dazed, found his iPod missing, and assumed theft was the motive. He never suspected anything more. I never told anyone about it, not even my wife or friends. Story 12. I once unknowingly carried non-prescription pills through customs in Abu Dhabi, completely forgetting they were in my luggage. Only later did I realize the risk, something that could have meant decades in a cell with harsh conditions, or worse. Thankfully, I was already far from the airport when it hit me. In my teens and 20s, I also passed along substances to friends after buying them, technically distributing without realizing the seriousness. I shoplifted a few times as a teenager, but quickly got too scared to do it again. For nearly 6 months, I also drove without insurance in the UK, which is serious. Your car can be seized, you get penalty points, and a heavy fine. I had no idea my ex, the registered driver, hadn't paid the policy. He let me drive around clueless, but karma caught up to him. The first time he drove in months, he was pulled over, prosecuted, fined heavily, had to pay to get the car back, and lost his license. I also once committed benefit fraud when I was broke by not declaring that I lived with my boyfriend. Ironically, if I had been honest, I would have actually been entitled to more support. Story 13. When I was younger, I did something really bad with a so-called friend. We wanted a quick way to get our hands on substances. We knew our dealer wanted a shotgun, and we knew someone who kept a large collection of weapons. In the middle of the night, we broke in and took a camo-painted 12 gauge. We stashed it in the woods, called our dealer, and later handed it over in exchange. Looking back, it was reckless and dangerous. Another story was accidental, but just as terrifying. I was about 8 years old, playing in the woods near a big creek with two friends. One of them bent over, and jokingly, I thought it would be funny to throw a rock at him. I picked up a huge, sharp one and hurled it, but instead of hitting where I aimed, it struck the back of his head. Blood poured out instantly. He was crying hard, and we rushed him home, lying to his parents and saying he fell in the creek. He needed stitches and was bleeding heavily. I was terrified that I had almost killed him. Even though we weren't caught, it was one of the scariest moments of my childhood. Story 14. One of my best friends, D, had just returned home from the army. He called me the moment he landed, around 10 at night. It was a freezing January evening, with a blizzard forecasted to bring a foot or more of snow. The wind chill was around -10, but I didn't care. I jumped in my truck to pick him up. We hugged at the airport, overjoyed he was home safe. To celebrate, I grabbed some ice fishing gear, a case of beer, and a bottle of whiskey from another buddy's house. And we set out for a lake about 30 miles north. The snow was falling fast, plows working overtime, the roads empty. We laughed and reminisced while I spun the truck through snowy streets. Once at the lake, we hauled our sled piled with supplies a mile and a half out on the ice. We set up the shelter, drilled holes, and cracked open drinks. But around 2 in the morning, the wind ripped our shelter away like a kite. We had forgotten the stakes. We packed everything back up and trudged to the truck, deciding to grab steaks in town. On the way back, I got a wild idea. When will we ever have the chance to do donuts on a major highway again? So we spun circles on the snow-covered road, laughing, recording, forgetting about the alcohol in the back, and in our systems. Moments later, flashing lights appeared. My stomach dropped. I pulled over, ready to face the consequences. I admitted what I did, apologized, explained we were celebrating D's return. The officer smiled, gave me only a verbal warning for distracted driving, and told us to be safe. He even noticed the case of beer, but simply said, "Keep it closed until you're done driving." No charges, no tests, nothing. We were stunned. We drove back out to the lake, grateful and relieved. To this day, I don't know why we were let off so easily, but I'll never forget how lucky we were. Story 15. When I was about 16 in the mid-2000s, me and two of my friends got a thrill out of getting into police chases on foot. Looking back, it seems insane, but at the time it was exciting and hilarious. We did petty things, nothing that hurt anyone, but we definitely pushed boundaries. There was a man in the local estate, a known offender, who used to wander around taking pictures of us while we played football. He constantly shouted that the park was on his land, even though his house was far away and separated by other houses. He threatened us often, sometimes with a stick he had made, and once even pulled a knife on us while we were sitting on a bench. That day, we fought back and left him beaten. After that, things escalated. We kicked in his front door, threw a plant pot full of filth inside, smashed his windows, set off smoke bombs and fireworks through his letterbox, and covered his house and car in flour. One night, his car was destroyed completely. We would climb a tree in his yard and taunt him, singing mocking songs, and he always flew into a rage. Every time he called the police, and that was where the real fun began for us, running. We would dart through alleyways, jump fences, and hide in sheds. My friend Josh, the boldest of us, loved to wait until the police actually got out of their cars before we bolted. We never got caught, even though others in the group eventually did. Somehow we always managed to escape, and as reckless as it was, we thought it was the funniest thing in the world at the time. Story 16. Over 30 years ago, me and two friends ran a little scheme after figuring out the delivery schedule of a liquor distributor. On Thursday nights, the company would load its trucks for Friday morning deliveries, then leave them unlocked against the loading bays. The yard had a fence, but it was broken in one spot right next to a back road. It was too easy. We would sneak in late Thursday night, slip through the gap in the fence, and check the trailers for cases of beer, cider, wine, or liquor. We pulled it off 3 or 4 times without issue. Then came the last time. I was inside a trailer grabbing cases when I heard my friend outside mutter, "Oh no!" Red and blue lights flashed against the bay doors. My heart sank. I climbed out of the trailer expecting to be caught, only to see my two friends already being loaded into police cars. Dogs were sniffing around, flashlights sweeping everywhere. I stood completely still against the wall of the building, less than 20 feet away, directly under a floodlight. I put my hands against the wall, waiting for the inevitable. But it never came. Within 30 seconds, the police left with my friends. They never saw me. The dogs never caught my scent. Somehow, I had been invisible in plain sight. My friends got off lightly since we were all under 18, but I've spent 30 years wondering how on earth they missed me standing there. It still baffles me to this day. Story 17. This one isn't about me, but about my grandfather, who told me stories from his time working on an assembly line in Detroit during the 1950s. At first, he was putting wheels on Cadillacs, and he always dreamed of owning one, though he knew he could never afford it. So he came up with a scheme: sneak out small parts in his lunchbox every day. He figured if he never got caught, by the time he retired, he'd have enough pieces to build his own car. He started with gears and small fittings, then a fuel pump, and eventually managed to sneak out enough parts to assemble an entire engine. For larger pieces, he had help from a couple of friends, one of whom used an RV to haul things out. The problem, of course, was that it took years, and the parts didn't exactly match. He ended up with a transmission from 1953, an engine from 1973, and body panels from various years. The car looked bizarre, with mismatched headlights and a back end where only one tail fin lined up. But still, he put it together, and one day he took his wife out for a drive. As they cruised down the main road, the strange Frankenstein car turned every head. People pointed, laughed, and gawked as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The paperwork for it all was apparently a giant stack, weighing 60 pounds. But my grandfather was proud. He said he got his Cadillac one piece at a time, and it didn't cost him a dime. Story 18. When I was 18, I worked at a summer camp that sat on a wide creek across from a seasonal lakefront campsite. The campsite was rarely full, usually just weekenders or vacationers on holidays. At camp, it was inevitable that staff started pairing off. Hormones, long hours, and close proximity made it almost a tradition. Eventually, the camp director caught wind of it after a kid told his mom that female counselors had been in a cabin, so he made a strict rule: no opposite S visits at night. Of course, that didn't stop us. A buddy of mine realized that some of the nearby seasonal trailers were empty during the week, so we came up with a plan. At night, staff would sneak a canoe across the creek, climb through a trailer window, and spend time with each other. We even set up a schedule so nobody would intrude on anyone else. At the time, it just felt like youthful fun, but looking back, I realized we were technically committing felony breaking and entering several times. At 18, none of us cared. We thought we were just clever kids finding a workaround. Story 19. When I was younger, I was traveling in the Czech Republic with friends, and we accidentally bribed police officers without even realizing it. We were using the trains often, but we hadn't stamped our tickets correctly. Uniformed officers boarded, checked everyone's tickets, and quickly realized ours weren't valid. They pulled us off the train briefly. We explained we were tourists, it was our last day, and we couldn't risk missing our flight. Instead of paperwork, the officers mentioned a small fine, We paid them about 15 to 20 US dollars between all of us, and they let us go. At the time, I thought nothing of it, just relief. Only years later did I realize how risky it was. Maybe they weren't even official police. Maybe they were just taking advantage of confused tourists. If it really was bribery, it could have ended very badly. Story 20. When I was 19, my roommate and I had a routine at the local superstores. There were 4 within a 20-mile radius, and we rotated them so we wouldn't be noticed. Around 11:30 at night, we'd go in with plastic bags from the store already in our pockets. We'd grab a cart, head straight to the alcohol section, and load it with bottles of wine and six-packs. Then we'd wander through empty aisles like baby supplies or clothes, bagging everything in the cart. When it looked natural, we'd head to the exit, always carrying a receipt in hand, pretending to read it the way shoppers check coupons. We walked right past the checkout area, out the doors, and to our car parked far from the cameras in a dark section of the lot. Every trip, we walked out with $80 to $100 worth of alcohol, and we threw the best parties in our apartment complex. We did it for months without issue. But 2 weeks after I moved out, my old roommate was caught. I think he had started pushing it, stealing more than just alcohol. As far as I know, that was the end of his luck. Story 21. When I was about 9 or 10, my parents played in a bowling league. It was more of a beer league than anything serious, and every Thursday they dragged me and my brother along. Most of the time it was boring. Sometimes my mom gave us $10 to split so we could play in the little arcade that handed out tickets for prizes. There was one game where you loaded a token into a gun, pulled the trigger, and tried to shoot the token into slots for tickets. I figured out I could slip a penny into the top, shoot it, and the machine would count it like a token. From then on, I brought a dollar in pennies every week. I spent most of my time finessing the pennies into the machine and racking up tickets. I was smart about it. I didn't blow all my winnings at once. I'd cash in just enough to get some candy so I wouldn't be suspicious and stored the rest. By the end of the season, right before our family vacation, I had thousands of tickets saved up. I turned them in all at once, walked out with one big prize, and nearly emptied their candy bins. Story 22. Right after I graduated high school, a friend of mine who was 23 and in the Navy called me about joining a music project at a place he called the Reservoir. I had no idea what he meant, but I said yes. We took a day trip to scope it out, then returned at midnight with all the gear. It turned out the Reservoir was a giant underground water tank inside an old military fort built around 19S. To get in, we had to move 2 massive tanks that were padlocked together and blocking the trap door. Luckily, my Navy buddy brought a hacksaw. The sound echoed like crazy while we worked, with 2 people keeping lookout for patrols. Once the trap door was clear, we climbed down a 25-foot ladder into this huge circular tank, easily over 100 yards across. The acoustics were incredible. We set up the recording equipment and played for hours. Brass instruments, guitars, everything echoing like a cathedral. We didn't leave until 4 in the morning. It was one of the best nights of my life, and I don't regret it at all. Story 23. Back in grade 5 during summer break, my brother, a classmate, and I had a reckless hobby, blowing up aerosol cans in an empty cul-de-sac. We got the idea from watching I Shouldn't Be Alive on Discovery Channel, where someone used a spray can and lighter as a flamethrower. Since our gated community had plenty of streets, but this one was unoccupied, it became our blast zone. My classmates supplied deodorant cans and bug spray, while my brother and I grabbed free newspapers from the clubhouse. We layered the papers, set cans on top, covered them, lit the pile, and ran to a ridge to watch the explosions. The blasts were deafening, like grenades going off. Once my friend's mom called while we were setting them off. She thought the noises were just video game sound effects coming from Star Wars, Battlefront 2. Neighbors constantly complained about kids setting off fireworks, and security would cruise by on motorbikes. We always hid in the trees and never got caught. Sometimes shrapnel broke windows or chipped walls of the empty houses, and the center of the cul-de-sac became cratered from all the blasts. Even 8 years later, the crater was still there, though eventually someone bought the street and built a mansion over it. We spent hundreds of dollars on cans, blew up at least 5 a day for a month straight, and miraculously, no one ever got hurt. Story 24. In my late teens, 2 friends and I planned an adventure into an abandoned life insurance building on a 142-acre property. We scouted it during the week and set Friday night as our mission. Dressed in all black for the cold February night, we parked just outside the grounds. To our surprise, a 10-foot barbed wire fence surrounded the place. My friends scaled it easily, but my weak upper body strength betrayed me. The fence carried a 10,000-volt pulse on a timer. When I grabbed it, I was shocked off, hitting the ground hard, motionless for nearly 15 seconds. My friends panicked, but I eventually staggered up. They urged me to try again. No chance. Even one of them got shocked trying, while the other escaped unharmed. Still determined, we looked for another way in. At the gate, we found the circuit box powering the fence. My friend opened it with a Swiss Army knife, and inside were bundles of wires. As the self-declared mastermind, I confidently said, "Cut the orange one." Right as he did, I noticed two outward-facing speakers and wondered aloud what they were for. Seconds later, a siren roared to life, loud enough to be heard for miles. We bolted, stumbling down a hidden drop, scrambled into my car, and tried to leave quietly. I drove back carefully, lights off until the main road. We thought we'd escaped until a week later when my mom got a call. Cameras had caught my car's plates. It was her vehicle. By sheer luck, the police chief was married to my mom's longtime friend. After some favors and IOUs were exchanged, we were unbelievably let off without charges or court. It was pure luck that saved us from a serious record. Story 25. When I was 16, I never really drank or used substances, but I had a reckless hobby. I bought guns online. One day, my parents opened a package addressed to me and found a Glock 33 inside. In Texas, you can legally sell a firearm to another Texan without keeping records, like selling a TV on Craigslist. I pushed the limits by convincing sellers to package and ship them directly to me within the state. It was against shipping company rules, but as I figured, the worst they could do was return the package. I had about a 10% success rate convincing sellers, but over a year I managed to buy 6 firearms this way. The most outrageous was a Desert Eagle 50, massive, difficult to handle, brass hitting me in the face every shot, but it turned heads at the range. Ammo was another challenge since you had to be 21 to buy pistol rounds in stores. Luckily, my mail carrier was careless. Despite packages being marked "must be signed for by someone over 21, he'd leave them on the porch. Once I realized that, I also ordered wine without a problem. The only risk was racing home after school before my parents found the deliveries. A couple of times, I walked in to see my mom sitting there with contraband in her hands asking, "Care to explain this?" That was also when I learned the hard way never to shoot inside a car. A friend and I parked at his family's farm with a Jericho 9mm. Like an idiot, I fired out the window toward a berm. The sound was deafening. The gas blew back into the car, and it felt like getting punched in the ears. It was a painful but unforgettable lesson. Story 26. When I was a teenager, I spent a lot of time with a friend who lived in a gated community with a golf course. The residents were wealthy and unfriendly, and they hated us hanging around. One day we skipped school and played golf. The groundskeeper showed up and immediately gave us a hard time. So when my buddy yelled, "Wreck it," we tore up the green and ran. Later, the groundskeeper came banging on my friend's door, furious. The police even showed up, but with no proof, they left. That night around 1 in the morning, we took my old GMC Jimmy and did burnouts all over the course. The next day at breakfast, we saw the same groundskeeper getting chewed out. Around the same time, another group of construction workers had been building a house across from mine. They left nails in the road, and once, one of them even used our yard as a toilet. So my friend and I waited until that guy went into the portable toilet on site. We jammed the door shut, lit a bunch of M90 firecrackers, and dropped them down the vent. The blast sprayed him with filth, and when they stopped, we tipped the whole thing over with him still inside. It was disgusting payback, but we thought it was justified. I also had a fast quad bike I rode all over farmland. On dirt, it could fly, but the tires made pavement tricky. One day, a driver kept playing games with me on the road, passing, slowing, tailgating. When we hit gravel, I pulled the front brake and gunned it, spraying his truck with rocks. By the time I got to my buddy's place, the guy considered confronting me, but seeing a group of us outside firing rifles changed his mind. His truck's front end was shredded from the gravel. Later, when I got a street bike, it was even worse. I lost count of how many times I outran police. The bikes were simply too fast for them to keep up. I know how reckless it was, but at the time, it felt unstoppable. Story 27. This one is hard to put into words, but here it is. When I was younger, I was deep into piracy. I was a site operator and ended up leading several of the top sites that were eventually taken down in December 2001 during Operation Buccaneer. Not long after that, I stepped away from that scene, but I slid into something else just as reckless: dealing. I started with weed, and within 2 years, I was moving much larger amounts of other things. There are parts of that period I'll never share. Things decided long ago to stay buried. But even what I can admit is enough to remind me of how far off track I went. Back in school, I even came dangerously close to being done for attempted murder after a fight where I tried to cut a kid with scissors. Thankfully, it didn't cause serious injury, but the fact I even did it still haunts me. Looking back, I realize how much of a disappointment I was to my parents, who always had high hopes for me. Now I'm 32, a widower, half crippled, and back living with them. It's not karma, just the weight of really bad decisions. Story 28. Back in high school, my friends and I got close with the security guard at a local grocery store. He turned a blind eye, and we started walking out with shopping carts full of alcohol. We sold it to people throwing parties, charging top dollar, and before long we were the beer guys. That label got us invited into the popular crowd. For the first time, everyone knew who we were. At first it felt like recognition, but quickly it became too much. Living under that spotlight wasn't what I wanted, and the pressure of keeping up the reputation made me uncomfortable. I got out while I could. My friends didn't. They escalated, breaking into shops and turning theft into a small business. If someone wanted something, they'd steal it and deliver. They started swiping cartons of cigarettes from grocery stores and reselling them at discount prices to smaller convenience stores. It was brazen, and eventually it caught up with them. One of my closest friends was charged with grand theft and served 5 years. From what I've heard, even now he still hasn't left that life behind. Story 29. Back in my teenage years, I managed to get my hands on a can of muzzleloader black powder and a pile of spent CO2 cartridges. I quickly discovered you could turn them into little explosives by filling them with powder and cramming a fuse inside. Then I took it further. Duct taping the cartridges to flammable cans made the blasts much bigger. On the edge of town, there was this stretch of road that had been built into the woods but never developed, so it dead-ended. That became my testing ground. One day I set up a cluster of 6 cans of silicone spray taped around a CO2 cartridge bomb. I lit the fuse, ran about 30 yards back, and waited. What followed was a massive fireball and a boom like a howitzer. Every house within 2 miles probably thought the world was ending and called 911. I didn't stick around. I jumped in my car and floored it before anyone could show up. Truthfully, I could have started a forest fire or killed myself with shrapnel. Looking back, in post-9/11 America, that probably would have been treated as terrorism. On another occasion, I was driving down a country road, mildly drunk, with a box of those homemade bombs riding shotgun. For whatever reason, I thought it would be fun to light fuses and toss them out the window, watching them explode in the rearview mirror. Somewhere in another universe, one rolled into my lap and ended me on the spot. I was unbelievably stupid and incredibly lucky to still be alive. Story 30. When I was 14, I skipped school by faking sick and decided to drive my family's spare car, a Chevy Tahoe, to Walmart to buy a video game. Walmart was just 2 blocks outside my neighborhood, no major roads, so I thought I'd be fine. I made it there without issue until I went to park. I turned down a one-way lane going the wrong direction. In that big Tahoe, I tried to squeeze past some cars, clipped a Cadillac sticking out too far, and completely demolished its rear light. Panicking, I floored it across the lot, parked far away, and watched to see if anyone noticed. Nobody seemed to, so I ran inside and bought the game like nothing had happened. When I came back out, the Cadillac was gone. I drove home as quickly as I could. The Tahoe only had a little red smudge on the bumper from the broken light, which I scrubbed off with soap. My parents never found out. I played that game all day, cringing every time the phone rang, expecting it to be about the accident. It never was. Story 31. When I was broke and desperate, I once heard that Goodwill didn't really stop shoplifters. So I went to the closest one and piled up a bunch of stuff. Jackets, pants, shirts, even shoes, stacked high in my arms. Instead of heading out the main exit, I stupidly tried slipping through the back employee area where they sort donations. I made it through one door, almost to the second that led outside, when I heard someone yell, "Hey!" My heart nearly stopped. An employee walked up and instead of accusing me, just said, "Hey, you can't go out this way." Playing dumb, I stammered, "Oh, well, where do I go?" While internally freaking out. The employee casually led me to the main exit, even holding the door open for me. I walked out, still carrying all the clothes. To this day, I don't know if Goodwill really didn't care about theft, or if that worker was just completely oblivious. Either way, I got away with it. Story 32. When I was younger, a group of 4 of us went camping with a friend, his parents, and some of their friends. We got to spend time shooting .22 rifles until the ammo ran out. Later, we hiked up a hillside overlooking a river. My friend, who had led us there, since it was his family's property, claimed he had 1 round left and said he wanted to shoot into the water. We didn't think much of it. But when a raft floated by, he suddenly started firing. Pop, pop, pop. More than 10 shots. The people in the raft screamed while we shouted at him to stop. He just laughed and said, "Let's get lunch." We never found out if anyone was hit or worse. This was way out from town and before cell phones were common. I never hung out with him again. To this day, I wonder if someone in that raft was seriously hurt. Story 33. Years ago, I stayed with a friend for a week of skiing and late nights. One evening, we were sitting around smoking cigarettes when the conversation turned to weed. His dad mentioned how he used to grow, then got a funny look on his face. He had us move an old planting bench from the backyard into the garage. From under a hidden panel, he pulled out 2-gallon-sized bags of weed that had been stashed for 10 years. We lit some up. It was harsh, but it worked. His dad liked me enough to offer one of the bags to take home. The problem was I was flying back. This was pre-9/11. I decided to risk it. I stuffed the bag in my ski boot, filled it with socks, zipped the boots into a ski bag, and checked it. At my destination, I picked up the bag and walked out without issue. Back home, I shared a bit with my roommate, then left for a week of National Guard training. When I returned, the entire bag was gone. My roommate had smoked it all. Story 34. This one's about my brother. We grew up near the big park in San Francisco where all the major festivals took place. Tickets were expensive, so during one event, he and some friends hopped a fence. Mounted police showed up on patrol, so they scattered. My brother made it back over the fence and regrouped later, lucky to avoid being caught. As they wandered the park listening from outside, more teens joined them, until they had a group of maybe 50. They ended up on a hill overlooking an entrance tunnel. As they approached, the security gathered at the gate. Someone in the crowd yelled, "Charge!" and the whole group sprinted. My brother and his friends, who were into sword fighting as a hobby, actually drew their swords and ran with the crowd. Security tried to form a human barrier, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of people pushing through. My brother saw some people detained, and he got separated from his friends for a while. Eventually, the crowd scattered, and later he reunited with everyone after the concert. Somehow, nobody he knew ended up in serious trouble, but storming a festival with swords was definitely not legal. Story 35. When I was 19, 2 of my buddies and I were sitting around bored out of our minds. One of them suddenly suggested we drive to Canada to buy weed and smoke it openly in a cafe. The idea of legally buying and smoking was too tempting, so even though I joked at first, the guy with a car was serious. We piled in and took off. Only problem was, we had $20 between the 3 of us. Clearly, we weren't getting far on that. For the past year, we had been running a little scam, taking items under $20 right off the rack at Fred Meyer, then walking them straight to customer service for a return. Since we never left the store, we told ourselves it wasn't theft. That became our gas and snack money. On the way north, we hit nearly every Fred Meyer from Eugene, Oregon, up to the border, probably 20 stores in total. We also filled up at gas stations and just drove off without paying. In one Washington town, we got so used to it that we both ended up in line at the same time with the exact same $19 handheld Tiger video game. When the clerk saw our Oregon IDs, we thought we were busted. I turned to my buddy with a huge fake look of surprise and said, "Scott?" Oh man, what are you doing here? We played it off like we were childhood friends who both just happened to visit our grandmas and get the same gift. The clerk was so amazed by the coincidence that she gave us both our money without question. We finally made it to Vancouver, scored $40 worth of weed, smoked it, and hung out for maybe 2 hours before heading back. It was reckless and stupid, but at 19 it felt like the best road trip of my life. Story 36. In high school, I got myself into a bad spot while buying near my house. Some guys came after me, so I ran and had to hop a fence into a backyard to cut through to the next street. I tossed my skateboard over first, then scrambled over an 8-foot brick wall. I landed in a small suburban yard with a pool, grabbed for my board, and that's when the homeowner's dog charged me. It wasn't huge, maybe a medium-sized shepherd mix, but it came fast. With no time to think, I caught it under the arms mid-lunge and, in stride, tossed it into the pool like a basketball. I kept running, grabbed my board, and flung it over the wooden front fence. That fence collapsed under my weight as I scrambled over, but I shoulder rolled out and landed on my board. Right then, the owner came out of his garage and I bolted past him without looking back. I didn't stop running until I was a few streets away. To be safe, I stashed my board and jacket in some bushes. A mile later, a cop pulled up asking if I'd seen a kid in a gray sweatshirt with a skateboard. I calmly said, "No, sir, only seen a couple joggers," and he drove off. 2 days later, I went back and tucked an envelope with $2 and a note that said, "Sorry, dude," into the homeowner's door. My board and jacket were still right where I'd left them. Looking back, I got incredibly lucky. If that dog had been bigger, the night could have gone very differently. Story 37. Once while visiting a university campus, I suddenly had to use the bathroom badly. I found what I thought was the men's restroom in the library, went into a stall, and took care of business. Afterward, I washed my hands and stood at the mirror fixing my shirt when I realized something terrifying. There were no urinals. Just as it hit me that I was in the women's restroom, I heard the door open. Luckily, there was a wall that blocked the immediate view, so I bolted back into a stall and waited. When the woman finally left, I slipped out and decided it was best to get out of there entirely. But as I headed for the exit escalators, about to pass through the security gate, I heard a woman shout, "That's him over there!" An older lady stood pointing at me with a student worker beside her. The student asked if she wanted him to call the police. In that moment, I formed a plan. I had run track in high school, nothing spectacular, but I could run a 400 in about 62 seconds and had some hurdles experience. I heard the first syllable of police, took a step, vaulted over the turnstile, and sprinted full speed across the campus. Later, I realized she probably thought I was some kind of creep or worse, sneaking in with a hidden camera. I read in the student paper afterward that they had no problem publishing names for that kind of thing. As embarrassing as the mix-up was, bolting probably saved me from having my name printed in connection with something that was just a stupid mistake. Story 38. I grew up in a small Swedish town of about 10,000 people. At 18, me and a friend spent most summer nights drinking and looking for trouble. Since you had to be 20 to buy stronger alcohol in Sweden, and we had no one to supply us, we came up with a plan. We had heard that Norwegian vacationers stored their booze outside in fly sheets at the local camping area, so one night we crept in, sneaking from tent to tent trying to find some. After hours of searching, we came up empty-handed and decided to leave. On the way out, we spotted a moped with a basket, and inside was a giant key ring with 30 or 40 keys. The janitor, an alcoholic who lived on site, had forgotten them. We took the keys and realized one must open the restaurant inside the campground. Sure enough, after trying them one by one, we found the right one. Inside were fridges and shelves packed with liquor. It was like paradise. We called 2 friends, they came with mopeds, and we hauled away as much as we could carry. We drank ourselves silly that night and decided to go back the next day. This time, 6 of us went, each with a bag. We stole expensive vintage wine, bottles of spirits, anything we could grab, and split it all in the forest. Over the next 6 months, we returned 6 or 7 times. When the owners changed the locks, we found the back door keys. When they changed those, we eventually even smashed a window to get in. Looking back, I can't imagine how much we took in total. It had to be worth thousands. It amazes me we were never caught. At the time, it felt like our own little series of heists. Now, I just feel lucky that we got away with it. Story 39. About 10 years ago, I was driving on a restricted license when I definitely shouldn't have been. Stuck behind a line of cars waiting to turn left, I got impatient and pulled into the right lane. Being the terrible driver I was back then, I sideswiped a woman's vehicle. We both pulled over and I got out as politely as possible, asking if we could just exchange information. She told me she'd tried that before, and it hadn't gone well, so we needed to call the police. Then she added, "But I don't have a phone." Without missing a beat, I blurted, "Oh, I don't either." She sighed and told me to follow her into the next parking lot, which happened to be a hospital. As she pulled out, two other cars slipped in between us. The hospital roads were narrow, one lane in and one lane out, and by pure luck, both cars behind her also turned into the hospital. She was trapped in line with cars in front and behind her. The only time she'd even seen my license plate was when she was passing me before the accident. With my heart pounding, I clenched my fists, took a deep breath, and hit the gas. A couple of turns later, I was gone. Not my proudest moment, but that's how I got away. Story 40. Back in freshman year of high school, I got busted for smoking weed with two friends. I wasn't even carrying anything illegal when I walked into school, but by the time I left, I was charged with possession of herb and coca. The herb charge came because I happened to be holding one of the pipes when we got caught. Everyone else admitted to their stuff, but I got stuck with that one. The coca charge, though, was unbelievable. Months earlier in algebra class, a friend, not even involved in this incident, had a bag of baking soda and cinnamon left over from home EC. He jokingly asked if anyone wanted it. I, being the random stoner kid, said sure and shoved it in my backpack. Then I forgot about it completely. Fast forward to my arrest. The school cop pulls the bag out of my backpack and waves it in the air. I stammer, "That's not coca," but it was too late. When my parents came to pick me up, we found out I was officially charged with possession of herb and possession of coca. They even called it crack or freebase. The bag had about the same volume as a quarter bag of good weed, at least an ounce or more. Things got worse months later in substance court. Even though I'd been clean, I suddenly tested positive for opiates, twice. I couldn't figure it out until I realized I'd been eating onion bagels covered in poppy seeds. They triggered false positives. My case manager accused me of using Hero and almost had me sent to inpatient rehab for minors. It was a nightmare, all over a bag of baking soda and cinnamon and a couple of poppy seed bagels. Story 41. Back in high school, a few of us decided to test our luck, breaking into our school's grade system, Power School. It took a weekend of messing around, but eventually we managed to get in. Once we had access, we were too nervous to make huge changes, so we started small, tweaking a few of our homework grades. Then curiosity got the better of us, and we began changing other students' test and quiz scores just to see if anyone noticed. Before long, we'd altered grades for more than 50 students, sometimes drastically, sometimes just a little. It didn't take long before it exploded into a huge deal with the administration. They threatened to call the police once they discovered Max, the guy whose house we were at, had been the one to pull it off. Max got expelled because hacking into the grading system was something the school couldn't overlook. But strangely enough, they were also impressed at how he managed it. He never ratted the rest of us out, so 3 of us walked away without punishment. The school switched systems the next year, moving to Infinite Campus, though most students never knew why. Story 42. I grew up in Hawaii, where my friends and I loved fishing and freediving. One year we entered a statewide fishing contest, with first prize being gear we really wanted. The first night, we caught a decent trevally, but it wasn't nearly big enough to win. The next morning, we decided to try somewhere else. My buddy's parents lived near Iroquois Point, where he had caught big fish before, so we headed there. While freediving, we noticed that fish were gathering deeper inside the harbor. Young and determined to win, we made the reckless decision to cross a fence marked "No Trespassing," military property, so we could get closer inland. We stayed hidden during the day, fishing quietly behind trees, and by nightfall, we still didn't have a big enough catch. We lit a small lantern to see, and that's when the Coast Guard spotted us. The moment their boat started coming our way, we grabbed what gear we could carry and bolted. They shouted over megaphones, ordering us to stop, warning that military police were on their way. Adrenaline took over. We ran harder than we ever had in our lives, made it to our truck, ditched it there, and sprinted all the way to a friend's house.